Welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 54, Draftsman and Copyist, the Personalities. This is kind of follow-up to one we did before about the difference between a copyist and a draftsman. But I think this is kind of going a little bit deeper into their characters. We talked about the fact that as I see it, as we see it, the draftsman is the artist, he's the inventor, he's the person who basically looks deeply into nature to find those things from which you can kind of uncover the reality and deepen your understanding of nature. The copyist is someone who basically kind of is slavishly dedicated to something else that is basically kind of his particular concern. So the copyist looks for resemblance and a draftsman looks for the essence. The essence may be in the pieces that he's kind of coming from, or maybe indeed basically something that he conjures himself. But as we are leading to this idea of kind of like original work in the adventurous mind, we kind of want to take this kind of time to kind of go through this kind of slowly so it basically is understood. Okay, so started last on Wednesday at the preview, speaking about a piece from Dostoevsky and Parasite from Freud's Character and Culture. So I'll continue. Basically, I kind of talked about this first piece, but then I'm going to go into an interesting, it's fairly long. This is like 2 pages, but I'm going to get through it as quickly as possible because Julie has a ton of ideas on this. I have a lot of ideas on this.
I do.
I think we've kind of talked about this for a while. So here we go. It can scarcely be owing to chance that 3 of the masterpieces of the literature of all time, Oedipus Rex, Sophocles, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, should all deal with the same subject, parasite. In all 3, moreover, the motive for the deed, sexual rivalry for a woman, is laid bare. The most straightforward is certainly the representation of the drama derived from the Greek legend, is this is still the hero himself who commits the crime. But poetic treatment is impossible without softening the disguise. The naked admission of an intention to commit parricide as we arrive at it in analysis seems intolerable without analytical preparation. The Greek drama, while retaining the crime, introduces the indispensable toning down in a masterful fashion by projecting the hero's unconscious motive into reality in the form of a compulsion by a destiny which is alien to him. Now, we know the story, right? But the idea is he's unaware consciously of his actions, but basically lives very viscerally and very intentionally in those actions, however, not understanding their full consequence. But consciously, doesn't understand the full consequence consciously, right? The hero commits the deed unintentionally and apparently uninfluenced by the woman. This latter element is, however, taken into the account in the circumstances that the hero can only obtain possession of the queen mother after he has repeated his deed upon the monster who symbolizes the father. After his guilt has been revealed and made conscious, the hero makes no attempt to exculpate himself by appealing to the artificial expedient of the compulsion of destiny. His crime is acknowledged and his punishment is thought it were fully conscious, which is bound to appear unjust to our reason, but with psychologically, it is perfectly correct. In the English play, the presentation is more indirect. The hero does not commit the crime himself. It is carried out by someone else for whom it is not parasite. The forbidden motive of sexual rivalry for the woman does not need, therefore, to be disguised. Moreover, we see the hero Oedipus complex, as it were, in a reflected light by learning the effect upon him by another's crime. He ought to average the crime, but finds himself, strangely enough, incapable of doing so. We know that it is this sense of guilt that is paralyzing him, but in a manner entirely in keeping with neurotic processes. The sense of guilt is displaced onto the perception of his inadequacy for fulfilling his task. There are signs that the hero feels his guilt as a super individual one. He despises others no less than himself, uses every man after his desert, and who should escape whipping. The Russian novel goes a step further in the same direction. There also the murder is committed by someone else. This other person, however, stands to be murdered, man in the same filial relation to as the hero. Dmitri, in the other person's case, the motive of sexual rivalry is openly admitted. He is a brother of the hero, and it is a remarkable fact. That I find that subtle nuance incredibly consequential, the fact of including the brother as a stand-in or as a kind of reflection. I think that kind of reflects the idea of the fact that that person that creates an action of consequence, or one who unconsciously understands consequence, is really quite beautiful. Then again, in the speech for the defense of the trial, there is the famous joke at the expense of psychology. It is a knife that cuts both ways. A splendid piece of disguise, but we have only to reverse it in order to discover the deepest meaning of Dostoevsky's view of things. It is not psychology that deserves to be laughed at, but the procedure of judicial inquiry. It is a matter of indifference who actually committed the crime. uh, Psychology is only concerned to know who desired it emotionally and who welcomed it when it was done. And for that reason, all of the brothers, except the contrasted figure of Alyosha, are equally, I can never know if that was the actual name. I just, because I read it, I never really kind of talked to anyone and that never came up, are equally guilty. The impulsive sensualist, the skeptical cynic, and the epileptic criminal. In The Brothers Karamazov, there is one particularly revealing scene. In the course of his talk with Dmitri, Father Zosima recognizes that Dmitri is prepared to commit parricide, and he bows down at his feet. It is impossible that this can be meant as an expression of admiration. It must mean that the holy man is rejecting the temptation to despise or detest the murderer, and for that reason humbles himself before him. Dostoevsky's sympathy for the criminal is in fact boundless. It goes far beyond the pity which the unhappy wretch might claim, and reminds us of the holy awe with which epileptics and lunatics were regarded in the past. A criminal is to him almost a redeemer, who has taken on himself the guilt which must else have been borne by others. There is no longer any need for one to murder, since he has always murdered, and one must be grateful to him, for except for him, one would have been obliged oneself to murder. That is not just kindly pity, it is identification on the basis of a similar murderous impulse. In fact, a slightly disgraced narcissism. In saying this, we are now not disputing the ethical value of his kindliness. This may perhaps be quite generally the mechanism of kindly sympathy. With one people, a mechanism which one can discern with almost finished, with special ease in the extreme case of the guilt-ridden novelist. There is no doubt, this is I love this wrap up. There is no doubt that this sympathy by identification was a decisive factor in determining Dostoevsky's choice of material. He dealt first with the common criminal, whose motives are egotistical, and the political and religious criminal. And not until the end of his life did he come back to the primal criminal, the parricide, and use him in a work of art for making his own confession. That short piece, I mean, it's 2.5 pages long, but that short piece for me shows the essence of the character, of getting to the essence of individuals. And I think for me, character and development is one of the most important things one can contend with. In this case, you have a synopsis in one episode with one activity of the breadth of the expression of genius, of beauty, love, and truth. So none of these pieces can be reproduced, but they all can be put in they all can be put in side by side to be analyzed and looked at together. So with that said, what we're going to do is talk about the nature of the individual who generates original ideas and the potential beauty that exists within that character, as opposed that to the individual who basically kind of takes this technique and basically kind of considers it in the realm of resemblance. Okay, so with that said, it's a fairly long introduction. Sorry about that. We come to the best part of the program, and that is This Week in Julie. So tell us, what is new in This Week in Julie?
Plenty.
Awesome.
Okay. This drawing that I've been working on at the Met is almost complete. I've given it a title today and a subtitle. It shall be complete on Friday. The title is Orpiment Alchemy, which is Parallel Vanilla Hesleri transforms arsenic and sulfur into benign hues. Can you do the honors and
Yes,
hold
my
up
loved one.
my drawing? The reason that alchemy is in the title is a key point. We don't believe in alchemy. It's a fascinating, wondrous thing. The stuff of sword and sorcery films, the stuff of wonderful speculation generated some wonderful artwork. But when a creature, when a process is so astonishing as this one is, when it is so completely, staggeringly amazing, what this heat vent dwelling worm, P. Hesleri, does is so unusual and jaw dropping, it is going to appear alchemical to anybody or anything watching it or knowing about it. So, what this deep sea dwelling heat vent living worm, which is a beautiful, rich, fully saturated ochre with pumpkin undertones, is just vivid. I mean, it looks like a nudibranch. It's not a nudibranch, but I mean, it has a coloration similar to a nudibranch, to a cuttlefish, to a poison dart frog. That kind of chromatic layering that is so luscious that few things measure up. What this worm does, if you can zoom on in, is it converts the incredibly fatal toxic chemicals that spew out of the deep sea heat thermal vents, in this case arsenic, and not just sulfur, trisulfides, just very deadly forms that would kill any other life. It converts them internally into a pigment called orpiment. And the very process of transformation, of conversion, of metamorphosis renders these two incredibly toxic substances benign, which is a feat that nothing else.
So that color kind of represents that.
Not only represents, literally is that.
So that color comes about as a result of this situation. So it kind of, so it becomes, yeah. So it basically shows an actual resultant, right, of that kind of particular process.
And what I have done is I have hybridized the beautiful worm, which has feathery antennae that are incredibly lush and fern or coral like, with a 13th century Cambodian bronze palanquin, which was used to carry people in, from place to place. In fact, this worm is carrying loads of lethally toxic substances in its own body. It is the palanquin.
So it basically kind of is kind of seen upon as that thing that which carries to safety that which is toxic.
Yeah. And in
Mhm.
fact, what I've drawn here in the background, which you can see here at the bottom, the left side here, is something that I researched, and in fact is the actual process that I found. What?
I was looking for something.
Scanning electron micrographs of. These are the chromatophores, these small ovals and circles that actually look like percolating, fizzing champagne, and that are carried through the tissues of this worm. And in that process, they are detoxified and become orpiment. It's just a wondrous thing.
So orpiment is the actual product.
It is the
It's the end
product
of this
detoxification of arsenic and trisulfur.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, it is quite a chimerical creature. And I mean, so what you've done is kind of extended the chimerical nature of this creature by adding it as you've reinvented it into an actual carrier, as if one would carry a noble character or a king or a queen.
Exactly. The people who were carried in the palanquins.
And in this case, I mean, it's a testament to the nobility of chemical exchange and detoxification.
Sure, which I've done with the coloration too. As the coloration, shifts tremendously from the oxidized bronze of the palanquin to through the body structure and the physiology of P. Hesleri, the thermal vent living worm. And so that's what I'm working on. And I hope to get back to my painting. It's been a really busy couple weeks. I started painting my work. So yeah.
Also, let me just say something before we forget and get too far into it, because now we'll go into the actual topic. We will most likely, when we see you on Wednesday, have some interesting news.
Oh yeah.
Right. So we'll kind of leave that as something to think about as we go into the next topic. But at the same time, we may actually have something that's going to be happening in the next couple of days that would be of kind of quite interest.
Of great consequence.
Yeah, very, very likely. Okay.
Tantalizing, is it
yes.
not?
So with that said, we are going to kind of go a little bit further into something we've talked about before.
Yes,
so what are these people and why do we need them? Like, is there a symbiotic relationship between the copyist and the draftsman, or are they just separate and then, kind of like separate characters? So anyway, in that case, I think I see, right, and this is kind of more of a kind of like a finding out, as I kind of never saw much of consequence. And again, I go back and forth with the level of developing technique, because I feel as if the value of technique is it can give rise to valuable consequential abstractions. And the abstractions are the things that allow us to move forward. I think technique can be a distraction, but I think it also can be a kind of like a generator. So the idea is finding that place, because I think a good example for me was always the way in which the institutions either were too unstable or too toxic to be able to kind of generate the valuable kind of consequence that gave rise to the abstractions that were created at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century in painting, that allow them to kind of be able to kind of manifest the great kind of manner in which the great painters of the 20th century arose, not as a result of the institution, but as a result of themselves, as a result of seeing the fact that they understood better as a result of knowing the consequence of what they were doing. So they were able to kind of take their technique and not kind of see it as something that was just kind of slavishly imposed on them, but since a lot of them had had it prior to any kind of educational institution, they were able to kind of manifest it. So I think in the pieces that I read about this character of Parasite, and looking at it as something that is a kind of continuing theme throughout the history of our literature, we come to understand the fact is that the individual who is the original artist basically wants to try to find the deeper consequence and character of things. I think that, Leonardo kind of talked, I don't know, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm paraphrasing poorly. He talked about the fact that coming from the darkness, that light, as applied by the painter or by the draftsman, was able to kind of uncover the aspects of nature. So in this case, I think, and that was also something that we read before in the case of Whitehead's analysis of the Century of Genius, that the artistic analysis of the realistic painter was something that actually had a keen understanding of the way in which one could generate abstraction. So that'll be a future episode. But anyway, so with that said, Julie, give me your thoughts. I mean, is the copyist and the draftsman, are they symbiotic? Are they separate? Do they have a relationship? How do you see them related to each other?
Yes, I will bring that up. I would like to talk about both the copyist first and the draftsman as having very misunderstood identities.
Okay.
And I believe that there is a consensus that's not really very accurate, by which the population and the masses in general see a copyist or see a draftsman. And I believe it's much more nuanced, and I believe there are niches, realms, environments, and if I may, the tabletop vanitas of both disciplines that is in fact microcosmic in its totality. And I have examples of that I'd like to bring up, starting with the copyist.
Okay.
Shall I quantify?
Yeah. And I think one thing we kind of talked about briefly in the preview was the fact that we looked at Hugh Ferris and Piranesi as good examples of people who were capable of taking their knowledge of the pieces of their time and managed to kind of like generate their own original work.
Yes.
And though they took things that had existed, their combinations and were unique and original, so that they gave rise to kind of things of their own merit. So I think that one takes, even if one looks upon something, it's what one takes as the draftsman. There's that allows him that sense of kind of deepening the nature of things.
Okay. Shall I launch into what I just?
Exactly.
Okay. I'm going to introduce you to a legion of copyists that have been forgotten in time and overlooked, but are crucial to the development of Eastern and Western history and the knowledge accumulation itself. Monk copyists. And I will talk about the salvation of knowledge itself. So, for those of you who are unaware, medieval monks who precisely, beautifully, dutifully, and these are my own original notes, and laboriously copied not only holy scriptures, not just the biblical texts and illuminated psalms, which was, one would think, their primary calling. Most people who even know about this believe it was their only calling. This couldn't be further from the truth. There were myriad types of religious manuscripts, and these were wholly analogized by the copying itself. So the process was a sacred calling. But I will introduce you to a new term of mine, which is metaphorical action. And a metaphorical action is, in this case, copying illuminated Christian, in most of these cases, manuscripts as vanquishing Satan. Their copying was a metaphorical action to the last letter, to the last illuminated drop cap. to every single brush stroke. They were combating the darkness all around them, and the Middle Ages were dark. This was not the Enlightenment or the Renaissance yet. They were combating the evil they perceived. I don't believe personally in God or Satan, but they certainly did. Every stroke of the brush, every illuminated capital, every swash of the pen was slaying the devil. So they used copying as a weapon, not just for personal growth, personal illumination, faith, and revelation. They fully believed they were combating the ignorance of the populace. And in many cases, they were doing exactly that. They also were engaged in this metaphorical action of apex cultural preservation. So this was far beyond the safeguarding and conservation of, as they saw it, Christ's words and God's directives. These monks literally protected the fragility of knowledge in a dark world, in perilous times, in barbaric times, when books were gone, when there was nobody to keep the flame alive of real scholarship. By copying, they copied Roman philosophy, Greek texts, ancient Greek texts, literature, and science. This was not a schism of science and the church. These copyist monks preserved science and they did not weed it out. They copied everything of consequence, everything of merit. They set about, basically, they were the encyclopedia makers before there were encyclopedias. And I would call it a citadel of essential knowledge preservation. And the final line of my own notes is, this speaks to the preeminence of all knowledge, both secular and religious.
It's interesting. I don't consider them copyists. I don't consider them copying, and I'll tell you why. These are transcriptions of devotion, and basically that devotion is an attempt to get at what they believe is the essence of these particular pieces that they're copying. So though they are basically transferring something, they're transcribing it, in my estimation. So they could say, because I see a copy as someone who's trying to basically make something that looks like something else.
You mean a facsimile?
A facsimile.
They created those of the Greek and Roman text.
However, what they were doing was not simply making something that was going to slavishly be devoted to that which came before. It was taking that essence and saying, this is even more so important contextually now. So that they would take the pieces that had their consequence in their particular time. So the word copying is what they're called. It's just like someone could be called
themselves,
right, exactly.
Too.
But I mean, in my understanding of the difference between the draftsman and the copyist is the same way as I would say with a composer. You know, because you've talked yourself about, was it Ravel, who basically transcribed Mussorgsky's piece, Pictures at an Exhibition, is that he understood a consequence that Mussorgsky had missed, right? And therefore, we kind of see the fact that the significance came about as a result of that transcription. So in this case, these monks took it upon themselves as a testament to their devotion to Christ, right? To basically say it's important that this essence be demonstrated. So it wasn't simply copying the words, it was copying the words in a fashion that would further emphasize the essence for the audience in which they were created.
But it was also, like I said, cultural preservation far beyond their copying, like the teachings of Christ or God.
Absolutely.
They would copy and make their facsimiles of ancient Roman texts, ancient Greek texts, books of astronomy, books of science that would have been lost, that would have been gone.
And I guarantee this is something we could go back and we could study. When we talked about the loss of 2D design, we talked about typography. the essence by which they created these symbols on the page and created these manuscripts was not simply to just take a T and put a T and take an R and put an R and write Christ and Christ. The way in which they were put on the page, the way in which they were copied, the way in which the types were made, right, was not a slavish kind of like reproduction. It wasn't a resemblance of the original piece. It was a full, freestanding, newly created transcription.
Yes, it was a creative endeavor,
Exactly.
fully formed.
Exactly.
These were not robots.
Mhm.
These were really inventive people.
Agreed.
Who like hand painted and
Agreed.
calligraphed
As a
everything.
result of their devotion to the essence of their faith.
Well, that's how it all started.
Mhm.
And then it blossomed into these other branches. I mean, think of the copyist monks as cladistic. If you have a cladogram and the monks are branching, there is the Christ teachings branch. There is the Word of God branch. There is their own particular church, their own particular monastery. Far beyond that, they created books on every type of mathematics, science, culture in all languages, not just their own.
Right. And each group having its own interpretation. So that in that case, it's not simply saying this is something. What they're saying is this is something in consequence to what we see from our particular perspective. So before there's a Reformation and a kind of like a whole reckoning of this, this is actually the start of this idea of what I think is beautiful about Christianity is the interpretation. I think one of the things that kind of is often
the salvation of knowledge.
Exactly.
Which is what I
exactly.
said.
So the thing is, these pieces were not afraid of those things beyond the scriptures. They actually went to include those things beyond the scriptures, which is something that the more kind of like retrograde religions have not been able to kind of keep pace with, which I think is why they become so feral and tribal. So, okay.
Anyway,
that's
go ahead. What I wanted to bring up about that.
Okay. Well, what else do we have here in our notes?
We have a lot.
Good. So let's go to the next one, because what I'll say briefly is,
would you like to say something about
I think that
posited?
like I said, I see this as transcriptions of devotion, because it's basically uncovering their particular understanding of the essence of these specific pieces that they copy. And I think there's going to be a case where in each case, this particular group is going to have their school of thought as regards these particular things. So there's actually a discussion as a result of this, rather than the idea that there's one and only one understanding or interpretation, which I always felt is one of the things that kind of makes religion incredibly feral. I think it's one thing to be anti-rational. It's another thing to be kind of anti-rational, anti-scientific. What I mean by that is basically just to kind of have a situation where it's completely devotional and there's no way to really kind of like look at it. I think one of the things that, again, that Whitehead talked about in the 16th century was the fact that even in the rationalism of the Middle Ages was coming about, where even science, even religion was kind of starting to understand the need to kind of be able to come more specific and more rigorous in terms of the thought, and the discussion basically became very fertile as a result.
Yes, and I want to emphasize this point that I made, but I'm going to make it again because it's incredibly key. It is a vital point. These copyist monks.
That's it.
Sure, thank you.
I love that. I love that.
You. That's how I am. So these copyist monks could have done what people are doing now, which is the bane of our society, which is cherry picking information to suit their own personal greed and goals and needs. So may I just say, and then I'm going to move on to this, that these monks did not cherry pick what they were copying. They could have eschewed science as unreligious, as unfounded.
Right.
They didn't have to believe it, and probably a lot of them did not. But my point is, they were intellectual enough, studious enough, scholarly enough to know how vitally important it was in and of itself. That's what I wanted to say.
True, and to rediscover the essence of these things from the Greeks through to the time that they kind of found them and basically kind of brought them back. So there was an actual kind of desire to understand the consequences of these texts.
Of science in particular, which
Absolutely.
is a segue to my next point.
Mm.
No one's going to see this coming. Fasten your seatbelts, as Betty Davis said. It's going to be a bumpy night. I segue to the anatomy riot of 1788.
I was there.
Bruce was there. So for those of you who've never read, and I urge you to read, Robert Louis Stevenson's phenomenal, I can't show all the short stories, more like a novella, The Body Snatchers. What The Body Snatchers is about, and this leads right to draftsman. You're going to love this. These were people who were grave robbers for the medical students and were very often the medical students themselves. So medical students for centuries had to moonlight as grave robbers. No kidding. And they could not get the cadavers that they needed in order to learn about human anatomy and physiology. They would get the occasional criminal that was hanged. There was quite a taboo against digging up a dead body. So the poor in New York City revolted against the city's grave robbing medical establishment. The medical professors were grave robbers. The people in charge of the medical schools were. And when they weren't, they would hire out professional grave robbers. So they were in league with the thugs and they paid them per cadaver. What happened, and I will say this honestly, and it is gruesome, is if they could not get a cadaver, they made a cadaver. Meaning they murdered a number.
Corpse.
Yeah, the exquisite corpse of Harlequin. So I segue fast to medical students. These are my own notes again. Routinely robbed graves to get cadavers for dissection that they really needed to do. Now, where do the draftsmen come in? You're all going to love this. Draftsmen chronicled all of this in gruesome detail, all of this for, hold on, centuries. So I will give you some quick examples, and then Bruce, I'm sure, has a lot to say. You need only look to Thomas Rowlandson's watercolor of Scottish anatomist William Hunter, a very notorious figure, very polarizing, in medical school in Georgian London. Anatomists outsourced the work to professionals. There's a watercolor. There is a caricature, a wonderful drafted caricature by the draftsman William Austin in 1773 of a corpse that they had acquired. There is a beautiful drafted illustration by 14th century Italian physician and grave robber Guido da Vigevano, I hope I'm pronouncing that, of a cadaver being dissected. So let me be perfectly lucid. There were legions of draftsmen in service of grave robbing medical students and their professors. If the students could draw, they were also the draftsmen. Very, very often they could not draw. If their medical teachers or professors could draw, they hired out draftsmen. They couldn't take photos. They had draftsmen drawing their dissections of stolen, grave robbed corpses. And finally, I will end with an amazing drafted Rijks Museum print from 1725 of a Dutch anatomy lesson. The Dutch were very vigorous in this, which is the workshop in Amsterdam, which was very big in the dissection. And the Science History Institute in Philadelphia is home to thousands of pages of draftsman's
Really?
work. Yes,
I should go
chronicling
see
this.
them.
We should. I bet no one saw this coming, Bruce.
Well,
Would you
actually,
like to comment?
yes, I would like to comment because I think this reminds me of things that I've felt. Um, I don't know if I'm proud of my Scottish heritage. My parents hail from Scotland. I was fortunately born in America, thank God.
That's true.
Yeah, but I think that one
On
of the
some
things,
haggis.
oh, God, honestly, I was telling someone actually just the other day that the reason why there's a British Empire and it wasn't a French Empire is because the French already had women to look at, they had something to eat, and they had wine. And
And wonderful culture, art,
exactly. So the thing is, they had no.
literature,
I mean,
opera.
and so the reason why there was a British Empire is they were just looking for someone to look at and something to eat. So that was the zeal of the
It's so
British Empire.
true.
But as relates to Scotland, and
Mhm.
especially Robert Louis Stevenson,
Mhm.
I always remember that Scotland still has two flags. The rampant lion, which basically I always saw as a symbol as the kind of feral tribal nature of Scottish people, and the very kind of like St. Andrew's cross, which is very rational, kind of like, kind of rectangle with a cross in it, which though it does have kind of like a kind of like a hearkening back to religious roots, it is a very rational blue with a white cross, kind of
Mhm.
from corner to corner. So I remember the fact that Scotland in the 18th century and the 19th century had become an incredible juggernaut, given the fact that a few centuries prior, as people remarked, during the kind of feral tribal times, there was maybe a handful of people in the entirety of Scotland who could read. So in the
Mm.
case of the fact that
Yeah.
like Scotland, as it becomes the kind of like engine of the Enlightenment and of the 19th century in medicine and engineering and science and art, it was still that incredible kind of tribal, feral, visceral people. So I always saw Stevenson's character as balancing between these two extremes.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
A perfect
I
example,
mean,
as
it's a brilliant
as an
book.
unresolvable conundrum.
It's the dichotomy of the Scottish
Exactly,
soul.
exactly. And
Yeah.
as Scotland rejected the kind of like rational kind of interpretation of the passions, as is illustrated so beautifully by Hume,
Mhm.
they have reverted to a kind of somewhat primitive mongrel race once again. And you think about the consequence that was generated in such a short period. But then, since I'd say Macintosh and Maxwell, they have been worthless.
Mhm.
And it's amazing to have gone from such feral tribal roots
Mhm.
to such incredible intellectual flourishing to back to just nonsense and gibberish.
It's
And
actually incredibly tragic.
it's incredibly tragic,
mean,
and it's
it
really
really
sad
is.
because I don't
They are
mean
the heroin capital of Europe.
and
Like
prostitution.
Edinburgh.
Don't dismiss
Oh, right,
the
yeah.
prostitution.
That's
I mean,
true.
they
They
honestly,
are equally good at
no, it's
prostitution.
true, exactly. And what is it they all do? Football hooliganism. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like
They
so.
start riots.
Yeah, so it's always been that chimerical character, but the
Mhm.
one thing that always kind of holds us together was the fact that there's always been a hope in Scotland because they've always appreciated in their own way draftsmanship.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, they
one of the
have.
things that I've kind of enjoyed is the fact that during the time of Macintosh, all the people in the arts and sciences understood the essential nature of drawing. Everyone had to draw. And when you look at
Mhm.
the Macintosh and McDonald and the Ghost School and the four that they did, they had an incredibly imaginative, kind of fantastic.
They had vivid
Oh, it was
imaginations. These
beautiful.
are
And I mean,
stunning
and I think it
pieces.
really was capable that was a place where during that time in the Art Nouveau, they were able to kind of really appreciate that impulse. And I
Mhm.
just love that. I mean, you've got me this beautiful book of Macintosh's drawings
I
and his
did.
paintings and his
And some
watercolors.
beautiful Art
Oh,
Nouveau
yeah. Well,
pieces.
yeah, this is beautiful Art
Yeah.
Nouveau piece over here.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've always felt that Macintosh, his architecture could have been the greatest architecture had it not been for the fact that no one was capable of appreciating him.
It was so far ahead of his
so
time.
tragic. But I mean, again, in that nature, in the Scottish impulse, is that tragedy. And I think it's a really poorly understood and is worthy of investigation. So I kind of carry that, I guess, to a degree, but I mean, again, I feel myself much more within the spirit of Bruce Goff, Frank Lloyd Wright, Buckminster Fuller, the kind of Midwestern kind of flourishing of what I would call an organic architecture. But I see an organic architecture, though it didn't manifest. It didn't manifest in Macintosh's architecture work. It certainly manifested in his furniture, and it certainly manifested in his drawings.
Absolutely, but isn't that fascinating about
absolutely
the draftsmen?
No, I think that's it. I think that
with
yes, and again, they were really draftsmen in the fact that they had a desire to express the engineering, mechanical, functional morphology. I mean, again, at this time, engineering and medicine are basically intertwined. So these draftsmen are trying to see these things as these mechanisms.
They're trying to understand and chronicle and preserve the knowledge.
And again, just like we said, trying to understand its essence, not simply make it so it looks like exactly what it looks like, but try to understand it as Leonardo.
These are pretty amazing drawings too.
I would love to see them. Yeah. But it's funny. I kind of think that was the kind of thing. Is it like Leonardo? I feel Leonardo, when I look at his buildings, I feel his civil and kind of like infrastructural pieces are certainly much more interested than his villas and his palaces. I find his villas and his palaces very derivative.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
he was very interested in that.
I don't think he was. I think he was more interested. He was more interested. He was. Well, I mean, I think he had, he had an impulse. But I think whereas he's incredibly fluid and imaginative in terms of the generation of kind of mechanisms and process of the city, the idea of a house or a dwelling or kind of was something that didn't really interest him because I don't think he understood or cared about it. So I think in that case, a lot of people misunderstand the real kind of beauty of Leonardo's architecture. It's in his understanding of the systems of the city, not the individual pieces. Anyway, so what's our next little kind of adventure here? Because I actually like this. I like this idea of you presenting these things, and then I kind of come up with my own kind of like views of them. We're not going to get to all of them, are we?
No, but let me.
Good. So then maybe next week we kind of do another
quickly.
one. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm going to bring up an aspect of draftsmen that is, I'd say, more nefarious because there are many, many associations. There is among certain cadres of draftsmen an enormous envy of architects and engineers because the draftsmen are not architects. Some are, but in most cases, they're working for architects. They're drafting the work of architects, or they're drafting engineering projects, but they are not technically engineers. There is an enormous amount of subterfuge, fakery, and forgery by draftsmen of architectural and engineering work. One very, very famous one is an apprentice draftsman. This is extremely recent. He was known as the man who wrecked not $1 billion, $7 billion airport in Berlin that is still not finished. He was hired for the Brandenburg airport. Turns out he was an apprentice draftsman. And this is a story you can actually look up. His name was Alfredo di Moro. He was not even a qualified engineer, and his job was chief planner for fire safety. And he wasn't qualified for that. And his quote is, "Everyone thought I was an engineer. I just didn't contradict them." He had only served as an apprenticeship as a draftsman, but he was able to somehow, using the knowledge of a draftsman pulled the wool over a substantial number of people's eyes in this airport. And there was also a very key case of two California fake civil engineers who both are now facing, I quote, up to 257 years in prison. This was back from
Well,
2018.
fortunately, they'll probably be paroled after 160 or 180 days, so they won't have to do the whole full term.
That is funny. One was an engineering draftsman. The other was an architectural draftsman. So the draftsman has, in most cases, enough knowledge to pass and do the work, but it turns out they built hundreds and hundreds of homes in Southern California, most of which are not structurally sound. Would you like to take this?
That's interesting.
It's very interesting.
One of the things that I think
there's a lot of envy among a lot of draftsmen.
Envy of draftsmen, or envy among them?
Among them, of architects, of engineers. I found stories.
Oh, absolutely. Because I mean, basically, the draftsman, the architect was a draftsman. But the thing is, they also hired draftsmen who were simply just draftsmen.
Like
so the difference is the architect understands what to draw, right? The draftsman knows how to draw it.
Yeah.
So the reality is, it's kind of similar to that thing I talk about the idea of the composer and the virtuoso.
Yeah.
I mean, you could see the fact that the draftsman is capable of certain interpretations and some certain virtuosities, but he may not have enough knowledge to generate on his own. I mean, is Piranesi or is Hugh Ferris, are they draftsmen or are they architects? Now, I mean, I look at the fact that the idea of the true draftsman is an architect, and the fact that he's capable of kind of bringing to the surface that which is hidden that needs to be revealed. The idea of deepening our understanding of the consequence of the configurations that we make is what makes the draftsman significant. Now, he also is capable of generating fraud. I love that.
Yeah.
No, I love the idea that he is capable of creating.
He is very capable for a long time.
What I would call an illusionary mechanism.
That's a very good term.
A fraudulent or illusory, because again, it could be an illusion. It gives the illusion of competence. It gives the illusion of consequence.
Fooled an awful lot of people, in fact, there are many draftsmen who have been posing as architects and engineers. I came across story after story, not for one project, for hundreds of projects.
Doesn't surprise me. Well, I mean, here's the thing.
No.
Here's the thing, is that, like, again, it is fascinating, and it goes to the nature of architecture. I mean, what's funny is most people will not understand the fact that a lot of architectural educators, and I was guilty of this myself. Oh, sorry, Pete. With a lot of architectural educators are not architects. And what I mean by that is, in order to call yourself an architect, you have to pass an exam, which is separate from your education. Now, once you are basically finished with your education, right, you can be a professor. You can basically now instruct those coming behind you in the way in which you have understood the mastery of your profession. So you have been certified to a certain degree of mastery, but you are not a registered architect. An architectural registration is actually a certification given by a national or international board certifying your ability to kind of state that what you draw can indeed be built.
That's really important.
One of the things we talked about last week is that architects don't build buildings, they build models. Models are speculations, they're imaginations. So in case, right, one is able to say, we have done the calculations, we have certified that this consequence is capable of being erected safely and kind of efficiently,
competently, and that it'll stand up and
exactly
work.
Now, if the architectural registration exam, right, was something that usually some people have been given honorary architectural licenses because they were incapable of kind of finishing the exam. Now, I mean, so the exam is a separate thing from your education. Your education counts towards it. But also, another thing was there were people who were able to sit for the architectural licensing exam, and I think you still can do an apprenticeship where you basically never went to school, but you worked for an extended period of time
as an architect,
with an architect, as a draftsman. And if you worked long enough, I believe it was 12 years. If you worked for an architect for 12 years, you were qualified to sit for the exam. And if you passed, you became a registered architect. Whereas you could have gone
a wealth of experience.
Well, that's just it. So in fact, this idea of the kind of architect, the kind of like, so we had these things. What did we discover? We discovered there's these Scottish pirate draftsmen who basically were these underground kind of criminals who basically used draftsmanship as a way to kind of explain, within within the medical profession. So these rogues and and scallywags were basically part of the essence of the generation of the beginning of the medical arts.
They were in league with the grave diggers and body
now we know that
who were the medical
that as the architect kind of basically became separated from the what now is kind of like the building superintendent, and the master builder kind of like concept is now coming. It's trying to unify that to point where the architect and the guild master were basically separate individuals, or before that, they were the same person. So the draftsman and the architect can give the illusion of being the same person. I am not a registered architect. So what I am is a draftsman and a researcher. Now, I never sat for the exam because I never had any interest in it, because actually, I'll tell you a secret. Most architects who were in the design and theory side never took the exam because they figured it was never worth the liability, given the fact that there were people who would sign off on your drawings. So you would get a civil engineer or kind of like a retired engineer who basically, if you needed a license, if you needed something for a permit or a set of drawings, you would simply pay them a fee and they would sign it off.
Yeah, that makes
But again, they
sense.
had to, because the reality was you as a young architect, we're not going to pay liability insurance and insurance
or be liable for something.
And the thing is, so
like
again, most of the things you did were interiors, or they were kind of non-structural components. So like, it was never, exactly. So this line between architect and draftsman has very much been blurred. But again, right now, the idea is that an architectural superintendent, right, and a construction company has to be a licensed individual as well. And that came about as the World Trade Center disaster in the Deutsche Bank building, where people were railroaded. Anyway, we've run along. We got to do this again. Maybe we'll do this. Well, maybe we'll do it next week, and then we'll kind of pass on. Yeah, we have a lot of stuff. So next week, we're supposed to do, let's see, where are we? The loss of the poster in the public square.
Well, that's a really
good one. So so let's say 55, 14th of December, the loss of the poster in the public realm. Or we're going to do part 2 of this, or we'll do part 2 of this some other time.
Yeah.
So we'll have to figure it out, because there's there's too much cool stuff here. Anyway, the realm of ideas, absolutely. The realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to keep it exactly like that.
Amen to that.